He was not just dead, he was impaled. Run through with a crude spear made from the rib of a giant beast. The three Na'vi hunters moved through the dense undergrowth, their tall, muscular frames tense with alertness. They were tracking something, and what they found made them stop cold. Their best warrior lay sprawled in the clearing, the bone spear jutting from his chest like a monument to violence. High above them, perched on a thick branch of a massive tree, Aston watched. He made no effort to hide. His body was covered in dried mud, camouflage that turned him into part of the forest itself. His eyes were cold, calculating. He was not prey here. He was the predator at the top of the chain. The hunters examined the body, their guttural language rising in pitch. One of them pointed at the tracks leading away from the scene. Another raised his head, scanning the canopy. Aston remained perfectly still. His breathing was shallow, controlled. He had learned long ago that movement betrayed you faster than anything else. On this world, the hunters moved on, following the false trail he had laid hours earlier. Aston waited until their voices faded completely before dropping silently from the branch. His landing was cat-like, knees bent to absorb the impact. He straightened and moved through the forest without looking back at the corpse. It was not the first Na'vi warrior he had killed, and it would not be the last. This planet had rules, and the first rule was simple: kill or be killed. The forest was thick with vegetation that grew in shades of blue and purple. The leaves were leathery, the vines tough as rope. Everything here seemed designed to cut, poison, or strangle. Aston had learned to read this jungle, to understand its rhythms. He knew which plants were edible and which would make your throat swell shut in seconds. He knew which paths the predators used and which clearings flooded when the rains came. His camp was 3 km to the north, hidden in a cave behind a waterfall. But first he needed to check his hunting traps. Food was always the priority. Without food, everything else was meaningless. The first trap was empty, the bait taken, but the mechanism not triggered. Something clever had eaten his offering. Aston reset it with practiced efficiency, his hands working automatically while his eyes scanned the surrounding forest. The second trap held a dead bird, creature with leathery wings and a long beak. He stuffed it into his pack. The third trap should have caught one of the boar-like animals that rooted through this part of the forest. Instead, when he approached the concealed pit, he found something else entirely. At the bottom of the deep hole, surrounded by mud and stagnant water, sat a small Na'vi child. She was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. By human standards, though Aston had no real way to judge alien ages, her skin was the characteristic blue of her species, but lighter than the warriors, almost sky-colored. She was trembling, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up at him with eyes so wide they seemed to take up half her face. Aston stood at the edge of the pit, looking down. His expression revealed nothing. This was a complication he did not need. The girl did not cry out or beg. She simply stared at him, waiting to see what the demon from the stars would do. Around the pit, Aston could see tracks. Not animal tracks, Na'vi footprints. Several sets, all leading away from the hole. They had not been searching for her. They had brought her here and left her. It was a custom he had observed before. Among the Na'vi tribes, when a child was born weak or deformed, They did not kill it outright. Instead, they left it in the forest, letting nature take its course. It kept their hands clean of direct murder while still removing the burden of a mouth they deemed unfit to feed. Aston turned to leave. This was not his problem. He had his own survival to worry about. The girl was a casualty of her own species' cruelty, nothing more. He took 3 steps before he heard the rustling in the bushes. Spinetail burst from the undergrowth with terrifying speed. It was similar to a panther, but larger, with chitinous spines running down its back and a tail that ended in a cluster of barbed quills. Its eyes locked onto the easy prey at the bottom of the pit. It did not even glance at Aston as it leaped downward. The girl pressed herself against the muddy wall and screamed. Aston stopped. The sound of that scream triggered something in him, some old instinct he thought he had buried. It was not pity, it was not kindness. It was the reflex of a man who had once been a soldier trained to protect those who could not protect themselves. He jumped into the pit after the beast. The space was tight, claustrophobic. The spinetail was already turning toward the girl, its jaws opening to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. Aston landed on its back, his weight driving it down into the mud. Creature writhed beneath him, trying to throw him off. He wrapped one arm around its neck, his other hand reaching for the bone knife at his belt. The beast bucked and twisted its spine, quills tearing through his shirt and scraping his skin. Pain flared across his back, but Aston held on. He had fought worse than this. His knife came free, and he drove it upward beneath the creature's skull, into the soft spot where the spine met the brain. The blade was crude, made from a sharpened leg bone of some massive animal, but it was effective. The spinetail convulsed once, then went limp. Aston held the knife in place for another 5 seconds, making sure it was truly dead. Then he pulled the blade free and stood, breathing hard. The girl was pressed flat against the pit wall, covered in mud and the beast's blood. Her eyes were even wider now, staring at him with an expression that mixed terror and awe. Aston ignored her. He grabbed the spinetail's carcass by its front legs and began the difficult work of climbing out of the pit. The walls were slick with mud, but there were roots he could use for handholds. It took him several minutes to haul both himself and the dead beast to the surface. Fresh meat was too valuable to leave behind. Only then did he look back down at the girl. She was still pressed against the wall, shivering. Without the immediate threat of the predator, she seemed to realize that she had simply traded one danger for another. Aston cut a chunk of meat from the spinetail's haunch. The flesh was dark red, almost purple. He tossed it down into the pit. It landed in the mud near the girl's feet with a wet slap. "Eat," he said in his own language, knowing she would not understand the words, but hoping the gesture was clear. "And get out of here." He turned and walked away, dragging the spinetail carcass behind him. He had done his good deed for the year. Girl had food. She could climb out of the pit using the same roots he had. What happened after that was not his concern. Behind him, he heard splashing sounds as the girl grabbed the meat. Then, after a long moment, he heard the sounds of someone attempting to climb the muddy wall. She fell back into the water several times. Aston kept walking. Not his problem. When he reached a Fallen log 100 m away, he stopped too. Better secure the carcass for transport. As he worked, he became aware of a presence. He looked up. The girl stood 10 m away, partially hidden behind a tree. The chunk of meat was clutched in both her hands. Her legs were scratched and muddy from climbing out of the pit. She was watching him with those enormous eyes. Aston stared at her. Then he made a sharp shooing gesture with his hand. Go, he said firmly. Leave. She did not move. He bent down, picked up a rock and threw it not at her but near her feet. The rock hit the ground with a thud. She flinched but did not run. She took a small step backward, still watching him. And GT, clear his throat. And GT, but she did not leave. Aston turned his back on her and continued walking. Fine. She would get bored or scared and go away eventually. He had more important things to worry about. But as he traveled through the forest, heading toward his camp, he occasionally glanced back. The girl was still there, maintaining a distance of about 10 m, limping slightly on her scratched legs. She did not try to approach closer. She just followed. By the time the sun began to set, painting the alien sky in shades of violet and orange, Aston had to admit she was persistent. He had tried several more times to scare her off. He had shouted at her. He had thrown more rocks. He had even charged at her once, and she had scrambled up a tree with surprising agility. But as soon as he turned away, she came down and resumed following. Night on this planet was dangerous. Temperature dropped rapidly, and the predators that hunted in darkness were worse than anything that moved during the day. Aston found a suitable tree, one with thick branches high enough to be safe from ground-based threats. He pulled himself up using a vine, then secured himself to the branch with a strip of leather, a precaution against falling in his sleep. From his elevated position, he looked down. The girl was huddled between the roots of the tree, curled into a small ball. She was shivering. The night cold was already setting in, and she wore only a thin, ragged garment that barely covered her small frame. Aston tried to ignore her. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep. His body was exhausted. The fight with the spinetail had reopened some of his older wounds. He needed rest, but sleep would not come. He kept thinking about the cold, about hypothermia, about how small bodies lost heat faster than large ones, about how he had pulled more than one person out of winter conditions back when he had been a soldier, back before the crash that stranded him. Here, he cursed under his breath, a long stream of profanity in his native language. Then he untied the old animal hide from his belt, the one he sometimes used as an extra layer on particularly cold nights, and dropped it over the edge of the branch. It fell through the darkness and landed on the girl with a soft thump. There was a moment of silence. Then he heard rustling as she wrapped herself in it. Easton leaned back against the trunk and closed his eyes. Just because he did not want her dead did not mean he wanted her company. Tomorrow he would find a way to lose her. Morning came with the sound of birds that were not quite birds calling to each other across the canopy. Easton untied himself and dropped to the ground, his muscles protesting the movement. He was not young anymore, and sleeping in a tree took a toll. The girl was already awake, sitting up, with the hide wrapped around her shoulders. She stood when he landed, then carefully folded the hide and held it out to him. When he took it, she stepped back to her now customary distance of 10 m. Easton sighed. This was getting ridiculous. He needed to check his other traps. Ones to the east. He set off without a word, and predictably the girl followed. Fine, let her follow. Eventually, she would realize he was not going to take care of her and would have to fend for herself. They walked for 2 hours, moving through terrain that gradually changed from dense forest to rocky hills. The vegetation became sparser, the ground harder. This was the edge of his territory, the boundary between his hunting grounds and the lands claimed by other predators. Both animal and Nari, they were moving along a riverbank when Easton suddenly stopped. The forest had gone quiet. No bird calls, no insect buzz. Just silence. He had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were screaming danger. The arrow came out of nowhere, hissing through the air and embedding itself in the ground centimeters from his boot. Easton reacted instantly, his body moving before his conscious mind had fully processed the threat. He grabbed the girl and shoved her toward the river bank. Under the bank, he snapped, pushing her toward an overhang where the water had carved out a small hollow. Stay there and keep quiet. 5 Nari warriors erupted from the tall reeds along the river. They were bigger than the girl, adults in their prime, their blue skin marked with white paint in patterns that signified their clan. They carried spears, bows, and clubs made from bone and stone. Easton drew his sword. It was not a proper sword, just a long strip of metal he had salvaged from the wreckage of his ship years ago, sharpened on both edges and wrapped with leather at one end for a grip. But it was metal, and metal was rare and valuable on this world. The warriors spread out, trying to surround him. They were trained fighters, moving with coordination. Easton backed toward a large boulder, putting solid rock behind him to prevent encirclement. The first warrior lunged with a spear. Easton sidestepped, letting the point pass by his ribs, then brought his sword down on the spear shaft. The metal blade cut through the wood like paper. The warrior stumbled off balance, and Easton drove his elbow into the Nari's throat. The warrior went down, choking. 2 more attacked simultaneously from different angles. Easton dropped to one knee, and both spears passed over his head. He grabbed a handful of the sandy riverbank soil and flung it upward into the eyes of the nearest attacker. The warrior staggered back, clawing at his face. The third warrior swung a heavy club at Easton's head. He blocked with his sword, and the impact sent vibrations down his arm. The warrior was strong, incredibly strong, and the next blow came immediately. Easton was forced to give ground, his boots sliding in the loose sand. Then he deliberately let his feet slip out from under him, falling backward. The warrior's club whooshed through the space where his head had been. As Easton hit the ground, he lashed out with his legs, sweeping the warrior's feet. They both went down. Easton rolled, came up faster than his heavier opponent, and drove his sword through the warrior's chest before the Nari could rise. The blade punched through flesh and scraped against bone. The warrior shuddered and went still. The fight had lasted less than 2 minutes, but Easton was breathing hard. 3 warriors were down. The other 2 had pulled back, reassessing. They were no longer certain this would be an easy kill. Then one of them raised a horn to his Lips and blue, the sound was deep, resonant, carrying far through the forest. It was a signal calling for reinforcements. Easton did not wait. He pulled his sword free and ran for the river. Move, he shouted at the girl. She scrambled out from under the bank and they both plunged into the cold water. The current was strong, pulling at them. Easton grabbed the girl's arm and let the river carry them downstream, away from the warriors who were gathering on the bank. They floated and swam for nearly a kilometer before Easton judged it safe to climb out. They emerged on the opposite bank, soaked and shivering. Easton immediately looked for shelter, for high ground, for any tactical advantage. What he found was a narrow ravine cutting into the hillside. It was defensible with only one entrance. He pulled the girl into it, moving deep enough that they would not be visible from the river. Only then did he allow himself to check his injuries. During the fight, one of the spears had grazed his thigh. The cut was not deep, but it was bleeding steadily, a line of red running down his leg into his boot. The girl approached him, her small hand reaching toward the wound. In her culture, touch was important. It was how they showed care, how they attempted to heal through simple presence and warmth. Easton slapped her hand away harder than he intended. "Do not touch," he said sharply. "You will infect it." She pulled back, hurt in her eyes, but she did not try again. She watched as Easton pulled out a flat piece of metal from his pack. It was part of a ship's hull, one of many salvaged pieces he had collected. Over the years, he built a small fire, using dry grass and wood shavings, then heated the metal in the flames until it glowed red. The girl's eyes widened as she realized what he was about to do. Easton did not hesitate. He pressed the heated metal against the wound. The smell of burning flesh filled the narrow ravine. His jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ground together, and the veins in his neck stood out like cables, but he did not scream. He held the metal place for a count of 5, cauterizing the wound, then pulled it away. The girl stared at him with something close to worship in her eyes. To her, his tolerance for pain was beyond anything she had ever witnessed. She had seen warriors cry out from lesser injuries. This human had just burned his own flesh. Without a sound, Easton wrapped the wound with a strip torn from his shirt, then leaned back against the stone wall, breathing through his nose. His leg was on fire, but the bleeding had stopped. That was what mattered. They stayed in the ravine until nightfall. The sound of rain began to patter against the rocks outside, growing from a sprinkle to a downpour. The ravine would keep them dry, at least partially. Easton built up the fire not for warmth, but because fire kept most predators away. He sat cross-legged, his sword across his knees, and began the ritual of maintaining his blade. He pulled out a whetstone and drew it along the edge. Long rhythmic strokes as they'd sha-sha. The sound was almost meditative. Across the fire, the girl sat watching him. She looked at her own hands, small and blue. In the firelight, they were unmarked, uncalloused, useless hands. She thought about her tribe, about the warriors who had carried her into the forest and thrown her into the pit. She thought about how they had walked away without looking back. Why did they do it? She asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the rain. She was not really asking him. She was asking the universe. Why did they give up on me? Easton paused in his sharpening. He looked at her through the flames, his face half in shadow. Then he looked at his own hands. They were covered in scars, calluses, old burns, and new cuts. They were the hands of someone who had done terrible things to survive. They are monsters, he said, his voice rough. They should not have done it. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her, as if she were a person rather than an inconvenience. The girl looked up, meeting his eyes. Something unspoken passed between them. In that moment, a recognition of shared outsider status. The next days were spent crossing what Easton called the Deadlands. It was a stretch of sharp rocks and minimal water where even the hardy vegetation of this planet struggled to grow. The ground was treacherous, all loose scree and hidden crevasses. As they traveled, Easton began to teach her, not out of kindness but out of cold pragmatism. If she was going to follow him, she needed to not be a complete liability. And if he died, she would die the next day anyway, unless she had some basic skills. He did not try to teach her to fight with a weapon. She was too small, too weak. A sword would be useless in her hands. Instead, he taught her to be invisible. You cannot defeat a warrior with strength, he told her as they rested in the shade of a boulder. Your strength is in not being seen. He showed her how to walk so that sticks did not snap under her feet, how to test each step before putting her full weight down. He taught her to rub certain plant juices on her skin to mask her scent from hunting beasts. He showed her which shadows were deep enough to hide in and which were traps that would leave her exposed. The girl proved to be a surprisingly apt student. Her small size, which had been a curse in her tribe, became an advantage here. She could move through spaces an adult could not fit. Her footsteps were naturally lighter, where Estan's boots left clear prints. Her bare feet barely disturbed the ground. One afternoon, as they were crossing a particularly steep slope, the rock crumbled under the girl's foot. She fell, rolling down the scree, unable to stop herself. Loose stones rolled with her, creating a small avalanche. Estan started to move toward her, but he was too far away. A boulder the size of a human head broke free from above and tumbled directly toward the girl's leg. There was a sickening thud, the sound of heavy stone striking flesh. But it was not the sound of bone breaking. It was more like the sound of stone hitting metal, a dull clang that rang out across the slope. The boulder bounced away. The girl sat up, clutching her shin. Estan scrambled down to her, expecting to find a shattered leg, bone fragments, blood. Instead, he found something else entirely. Where the boulder had struck, the girl's delicate blue skin had turned black and hard, like the chitinous shell of an armored insect. The transformation covered an area about the size of his palm, the skin rigid and slightly glossy. As he watched, the black color slowly faded, lightening back to blue. The hard texture softened. Within 30 seconds, her skin looked normal again. Estan carefully felt her leg, checking for breaks. There were none. The bone was intact, not even bruised. "It is not a sickness, girl," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It is armor. Body reacts to threats faster than you can think." He sat back, understanding. Now, this was why her tribe had discarded her. The Nari valued strength, visible power. This girl's defense did not manifest unless she was in mortal danger. In the daily life of the tribe, she would have seemed weak and ordinary. They would not have known about her armor until it was too late to matter. But Estan recognized the value. On a world where survival was measured in moments, a defense that activated automatically could mean the difference between life and death. You are not weak, he told her. You are just built for a different kind of fighting. Over the next 2 days, they continued through the deadlands. Astan's leg wound was healing, but slowly. He could tell it was getting infected despite the cauterization. The skin around the burn was hot and red. His body was fighting the infection, but it was a battle that was draining his strength. On the 3rd day, they reached a massive waterfall that cut across their path. Behind them, Astan could hear the bang of hunting beasts. The Nari had not given up. They had brought their tracker beasts, massive reptilian creatures with an incredible sense of smell. The beasts had picked up the trail from Astan's wounded leg, following the scent of blood and infection. Astan looked at the waterfall, then at the girl, then back the way they had come. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. With his wounded leg, he could not move fast enough. Tracker beasts would catch them within minutes. Together, they were both dead. Apart, she had a chance. This is a dead end, he said, his voice flat for 2 people. He scanned the cliff face and spotted a narrow vertical crack in the rock, mostly hidden by moss and vines. It was barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, but perfect for a child. He grabbed the girl and pushed her toward it. She resisted, trying to pull away, but he was much stronger. Listen to me, he said, his voice urgent. You stay in there, no matter what you hear. Even if you hear me screaming, you do not come out. When everything goes quiet, you follow the river downstream, understand? She grabbed his hand, trying to hold on. Her eyes pleading, he pulled Clear's throat, his hand free, but for just a moment his expression softened. Then he pushed her into the crack and began covering the entrance with moss and loose rocks, making it look natural. Astan walked out onto the open plateau. In front of the ravine, he could hear the beasts now, their guttural barks echoing off the cliffs. He drew his sword and struck it against a boulder, sending up sparks. Then he threw his head back and roared, a sound of challenge and defiance that carried across the valley. He was making himself impossible to ignore, drawing all attention to himself. The tracker beasts burst from the tree line first, massive 6-legged reptiles with jaws that could crush bone. Behind them came the warriors, at least 20 of them. They saw the demon standing alone on the plateau, and they rushed forward like a wave. Astan killed the first beast that reached him, driving his sword through its eye and into its brain. He crippled a warrior who got too close, cutting deep into the Nari's leg, but there were too many, far too many. Heavy nets made from braided sinew flew through the air. They wrapped around Astan, tangling his arms and legs. He went down hard, his sword knocked from his grip. Warriors swarmed over him, beating him with the halves of their spears, striking him in the ribs, the head, the shoulders. Hidden in her crack in the rock, the girl pressed her eye to get in the moss. She watched as they overwhelmed him, as the proud warrior who had killed so many was beaten down like an animal. She watched as they bound his hands behind his back with thick rope and began dragging him away, his heels leaving furrows in the dirt. She pressed both hands over her mouth, physically holding back the scream that wanted to escape. Tears ran down her blue cheeks, but she made no sound. They hauled him away, leaving only trampled ground and drops of blood. The girl waited. She waited as the sounds of the war party faded into the distance. She waited as the sun set and the forest grew dark. She waited until she was absolutely certain they were gone. Then she emerged from the crack. She stood on the plateau looking at the two paths before her. To the left, the river led downstream, toward potential freedom and survival. The path Astan had told her to take, to the right, broken branches and drops of blood marked the trail back to the Nari village. She looked at the small bone knife Astan had given her days ago, trophy from one of their hunts. She gripped it so tightly her knuckles turned pale blue, almost white. Then she turned right and began following the blood trail. She moved the way he had taught her, testing each step, staying low, using the shadows. She was no longer prey. She was a hunter, even if she was a small one who had never made a kill. The Nari village was lit by dozens of torches, turning night into an orange twilight. In the center of the settlement, tied to a thick wooden post, was Astan. His face was beaten, one eye swollen shut, blood crusted in his hair. But his head was up, his jaw set. Even battered and bound, he had not been broken. The entire village had gathered. Women, children, and warriors formed a circle around him. This was more than an execution. It was a celebration, a festival. The demon who had killed their hunters, who had evaded their trackers, had finally been caught. The chief of the tribe emerged from the largest hut. He was a giant even among the Nari, standing nearly 7 feet tall. A massive scar ran from his forehead, across his nose and down to his jaw. In his hands he carried not a sword or spear, but a war hammer made from stone and bone. It was as large as a child and would crush bone to powder. He walked slowly toward Astan, savoring the moment. The crowd roared its approval. The girl crouched at the edge of the village, hidden in the shadows between 2 huts. She could see everything, but no one was looking outward. All eyes were on the spectacle in the center. She remembered Astan's words, "Your strength is in not being seen." She could not fight 20 warriors. She would die in seconds, but she did not need to fight. She needed to create chaos. Behind the huts was a large pen, where the tribe kept their work animals. Massive 6-legged reptilian beasts they called thignecks. The animals were placid during the day, but easily spooked. The girl moved like a ghost between the shadows, unseen by the distracted villagers. She reached the animal pen and looked for the weakest point. The fence was made of lashed-together poles, strong but dependent on the bindings. She found where they stored the fodder, dry grass and plant stalks. She pulled her small fire-starting kit from her pouch, the one Astan had shown her how to make. 2 pieces of flint and a small bundle of tinder. Her hands shook as she struck the stones together. Once, twice, 3 times a spark caught. The tinder began to smoke, then flame. She fed it carefully with dry grass until she had a small fire going, then pushed it against the hay. The flame spread quickly. The dry fodder went up like it had been soaked in oil. The fire reached the fence post. The smell of smoke reached the thignecks, and they began to bellow in panic. The girl did not wait to see the result. She was already moving, circling around the other side of the village, heading toward the center where Astan was tied. The fence posts began to crack and splinter as the panicked thignecks threw their weight against them. Then, with a tremendous crash, the fence gave way. 6 massive animals, each weighing Several tons thundered into the village. Chaos erupted. The beasts were blind with fear, smashing through huts, knocking over fire pits, scattering the gathered crowd. Warriors ran to contain them, to protect the women and children. The chief turned away from his captive, bellowing orders. In the confusion of smoke and stampeding animals and shouting Nari, no one noticed the small blue figure that darted through the chaos toward the center post. The girl reached Astan and immediately began sawing at the ropes with her knife. The blade was small and the ropes were thick, but she worked frantically. Astan, through his swollen eyes, stared at her in disbelief. "You were supposed to run," he said, his voice rough. "Stupid girl." "We do not leave our own," she replied, never stopping her work on the ropes. The ropes parted. Astan's hands came free. He rubbed the circulation back into his wrists, then spotted his sword lying on the ground nearby, where the guards had abandoned it to chase the animals. He snatched it up. His face changed. The pain seemed to leave it, replaced by something cold and lethal. He was no longer a captive. He was a weapon. They tried to slip away in the confusion, but they were not fast enough. The chief saw his prisoner freed and roared in fury. He charged through the panicking crowd, shoving his own people aside, his war hammer raised high. Astan was exhausted, injured, weakened by days of captivity. He managed to block the first massive swing, but the impact of the stone hammer against his metal sword sent painful vibrations through his arms. His grip loosened. The second blow knocked the sword completely from his hands, and the force of it drove Astan to the ground. The chief loomed over him, a mountain of muscle and rage. He lifted the war hammer above his head, holding it there for a moment, wanting everyone to witness the final blow that would crush the demon's skull. Astan could not roll away in time. His body would not respond fast enough. He looked up at the descending hammer, at death coming for him at last. Then a small blue shape flashed in from the side. The girl threw herself at Astan, not attacking the chief, but covering the human with her own body. She pressed herself against his chest, her back exposed to the descending hammer. The stone weapon, 20 kg of shaped granite, fell like a meteor. The impact was tremendous, but instead of the wet crunch of breaking bones and pulped flesh, there was a different sound, ringing metallic boom that echoed across the village. Ba-ba boom. The hammer bounced off the girl's back as if it had struck an anvil. The shock of the rebound traveled up the hammer's handle and into the chief's arms. He staggered backward, his face contorted in confusion and pain. The girl's entire back had turned black and rigid, harder than any armor the Nari had ever crafted. In the instant of mortal terror, her body's defense had activated at full power. She had become a living shield. The reprieve lasted only a second, but it was the only second Astan needed. His hand found the boot knife he always kept as a backup. It was barely longer than his palm, but it had an edge like a razor. As the chief tried to recover his balance, Astan lunged upward from the ground. The knife found the gap between two ribs and drove home. Astan put all his weight behind the thrust, pushing the blade deep into the chief's heart. The giant Nari staggered, blood poured from his mouth. He looked down at the small knife buried in his chest, as if unable to believe something so insignificant could kill him. Then his legs gave out and he fell, hitting the ground like a felled tree. Silence spread across the village like a wave. The warriors who had been chasing animals stopped. The women and children who had been fleeing froze. Everyone stared at the impossible scene before them. Their chief was dead. The demon lived, and the small girl who had been abandoned in the forest had just survived a blow that would have killed a bull. Her armor slowly faded, the black hardness receding like water draining away, leaving only soft blue skin. She collapsed unconscious from the shock and the tremendous energy her body had expended. Aston struggled to his feet and picked up the girl, cradling her in his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He looked at the assembled Nari warriors. They were armed. They outnumbered him 20-1, but not one of them moved to attack. In their culture, strength commanded respect. The girl had demonstrated strength beyond their understanding. To attack her now would be to anger the spirits they believed watched over the worthy. Aston walked toward the edge of the village. The crowd parted before him like water around a stone. No one spoke. No one raised a weapon. They simply watched as the demon carried the small God-touched child into the darkness. Beyond the torchlight, the forest closed around them, dark and cold. Aston kept walking, putting distance between them and the village. His leg was agony. His ribs were probably cracked, and every breath hurt. But he did not stop until he judged they were far enough away to be relatively safe. He found a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock and carefully laid the girl down. Her breathing was steady, her heart beat strong. She was not injured, just exhausted. Her body had poured all its resources into that momentary transformation, and now it needed to recover. Aston sat down beside her, his back against the stone, and finally allowed himself to feel the full extent of his injuries. He was a mess, but he was alive. They were both alive. He looked down at the sleeping child. Her face was peaceful. Now all the fear and determination smoothed away by unconsciousness. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead. "You are not bait anymore," he whispered. "You are my shield." The words were a promise and a recognition. She had saved his life, just as he had once saved hers. In this brutal world, such bonds were stronger than blood, forged in survival and sealed with sacrifice. The night deepened around them. Somewhere in the forest something howled, a long, mournful sound that spoke of hunger and hunting. Aston tightened his grip on his sword and kept watch. The dawn came slowly, the alien sun rising in a sky that was more purple than blue. The girl stirred first, her eyes opening slowly. She looked confused for a moment, then memory returned. She sat up quickly, wincing. "Easy," Aston said. "You took a hit that would have killed most things. Your body needs time to recover." She looked at him, then at her arms and hands. The skin was normal blue and soft. She flexed her fingers, testing. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you jump into that pit to save me? Why did you come back for me?" Aston was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you are not bait. Bait has to be alive for the trap to work, but you were never meant to be caught. You were meant to survive." Girl did not fully understand, but she sensed the truth beneath his words. He had not saved her out of pity or because he needed something from her. He had saved her because in her he had seen something worth saving, someone who would fight to live, no matter the odds. They sat in silence as the sun climbed, higher, bringing warmth to the cold. Morning. Around them, the forest began to wake, the creatures of the day starting their eternal search for food and safety. The world continued its brutal cycle, indifferent to their small drama of survival. But Astan and the girl were different. Now they were no longer solitary survivors navigating a hostile world. Alone. They were a unit, a team, the human with his experience and strength, and the Nari child with her unexpected gift and fierce determination to live. After eating the last of their food, a stringy piece of dried meat, they began to move again. Astan's clear throat, leg was bad, but he had lived with worse. The girl walked beside him now, not behind. She was still small and young, but there was something different in the way she carried herself. She had faced death and defied it. That changed a person, no matter their age or species. They talked little as they traveled, but the silence was comfortable. Astan taught as they went, pointing out useful plants, showing her how to read animal tracks, explaining which trees had bark strong enough to make rope and which had sap that could be used as waterproof sealant. The girl absorbed it all with the intensity of someone who knew that knowledge was survival. She asked questions in her halting attempts at his language, and he answered them. Slowly, a pidgin communication developed between them, a mixture of his words, her words, and gestures that served them better than either language alone. Days passed into weeks. They moved through territories that Astan had not explored before, always heading generally north toward what he hoped might be cooler, more temperate lands. The wound on his leg healed, though it left a nasty scar. The girl grew stronger, her body adapting to the constant physical demands of their nomadic life. One evening, as they sat by their fire, eating a fish thing Astan had, Clear's throat speared from a stream. The girl spoke. Name, she said, pointing at him. Your name. He looked at her for a moment. They had been together for weeks, and he had never told her his name. She had never asked, and he had never offered. Astan, he said finally. Astan, she repeated carefully. Then she pointed at herself. Barbissa. Barbissa, he repeated back, trying to match her pronunciation. She nodded, satisfied. Then she looked at him seriously. Tribe, we tribe now. Astan considered the question. In her culture, the tribe was everything. It was identity, purpose, survival. She was asking if they were family now, if they belonged to each other in that way that mattered. He thought about all the people he had left behind, the world he had crashed from, the life he had lost. He thought about the years of solitary survival, of trusting no one, because trusting someone meant they could hurt you or leave you. He thought about how exhausting it was to be alone, to carry every burden by yourself. Then he looked at the small blue child who had thrown herself in front of a death blow meant for him, who had chosen to face a village of warriors rather than save herself, who had proven herself 100 times over. Yes, he said, we are a tribe of two. Barbissa smiled. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and it transformed her face. She looked like what she was, a child, not a survivor, not a warrior in training, but just a child who had found something precious in this harsh world. Astan felt something in his chest loosen, some tight knot he had not even realized he was carrying. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to belong to someone, to be responsible for another life, not out of obligation, but out of choice. They finished their meal in companionable silence, then banked the fire for the night. Estan took the first watch as always, but now as he sat with his back against the tree, his sword across his knees, he was not just watching for threats, he was watching over someone. The stars above were wrong, the constellations clear as throat. Alien and meaningless, the sounds of the night were the calls of creatures that had never existed on Earth. The air smelled of plants that had no names in any human language. But sitting there with Barbissa sleeping peacefully nearby, wrapped in the old hide, Estan felt something he had not felt since the crash. He felt like he had a reason to survive. Beyond simple stubbornness, he had someone to protect, someone who also protected him. He had purpose again, whatever tomorrow brought, whether it was hostile tribes, or dangerous beasts, or environmental hazards. They would face it together, a human from a dead world and a Nari child cast out by her own kind, forming something new in the wilderness. In the darkness, something howled. Estan tightened his grip on his sword and smiled grimly. Let it come, whatever it was, it would find them ready. The fire crackled softly, sending up sparks that rose into the alien night. Two survivors from different worlds, sitting together against the darkness. Not bait and hunter, not rescuer and rescued, but something simpler and more profound. Family forged in blood and survival, tempered by sacrifice and choice. And in this brutal, beautiful, impossible world, that was enough. Months passed and the seasons changed. The brutal heat gave way to cooler winds. Estan and Barbissa moved through the wilderness like spirits, leaving little trace of their passage. They were learning each other's rhythms, developing the kind of unspoken communication that came from constant proximity and shared danger. Barbissa was growing, not just physically, though she was taller and stronger now, but in capability. She could start a fire in under a minute. With her flint and steel, she could identify dozens of edible plants and knew which water sources were safe. Most importantly, she had lost the hesitation that marked someone as prey. When danger came, she reacted with the same instant decisiveness as Estan. They were following a game trail one afternoon when they spotted smoke rising above the trees ahead. Smoke meant people, and people meant potential danger, but it also meant the possibility of trade, of information, of civilization. Estan signaled for Barbissa to wait. While he scouted ahead, he moved through the underbrush silently, a skill he had perfected over his years on this planet. The smoke came from a small encampment, not a permanent settlement. 3 Nari sat around a fire, but these were different from the warriors they had encountered before. They were older, their skin marked with elaborate tattoos. Rather than war paint, traders, possibly, or explorers. One of them was telling a story, his voice carrying through the still air. Estan's understanding of the Nari language was still limited, but he caught enough words to piece together the tale. They were talking about a legend, about a demon from the stars and a cursed child who had become his shield. The story had spread, growing with each telling. In the tale, the demon was 10 feet tall and breathed fire. The child could turn her entire body to stone at will. They had destroyed an entire village, leaving only ashes behind. The truth had become myth. distorted but recognizable. Estan pulled back and returned to it. Barbissa waited. "We are famous," he told her dryly. "They are telling stories about us." "Good stories?" she asked, terrifying. "Stories," he corrected, "which is good. For us, fear is a better shield than armor." They bypassed the camp, not wanting to test whether the traders would recognize them, but the encounter made Estan think they could not wander the wilderness forever. Eventually they would need to find a place to settle, at least temporarily, somewhere defensible, where they could build a real shelter, store supplies, prepare for the harsh winter that would eventually come. They continued north for another week. Before they found it, a small valley fed by a stream surrounded by steep cliffs. On 3 sides, there was only one easy entrance, and that could be defended by a single person. The valley floor was fertile, with fruit-bearing trees and signs of small game animals. "Here," Estan said, "we build here." Building took time. They constructed a shelter using logs and branches, reinforcing it with mud and stones. It was not pretty, but it was solid and waterproof. Estan built a raised platform inside for sleeping, keeping them off the ground and away from insects and small predators. He made a hearth for the fire with a crude chimney to vent the smoke. Barbissa worked alongside him, learning carpentry skills to add to her growing repertoire of survival knowledge. Her small hands were good for detailed work, tying intricate knots and weaving branches together for wall panels. They set traps around the valley's entrance, both for catching food and for warning them of intruders. Estan showed Barbissa how to construct snares and deadfalls, how to position them where animals naturally walked. In the evenings they trained. Estan had accepted that Barbissa would never be a frontline fighter with weapons too large for her. Instead, he focused on teaching her to move, to evade, to strike from surprise, and then vanish. He taught her where to hit to disable, rather than kill, because she lacked the strength for lethal blows against adult Nari. She proved to be a natural at this kind of fighting. She was fast, flexible, and had an intuitive understanding of angles and leverage. When she struck at the practice dummy Estan had made, she went for knees, throats, eyes, vulnerable points where size mattered less than precision. One evening, as they rested after training, Barbissa asked a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Why you here? Why you fall from sky?" Estan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. He had not talked about it, had not even let himself think about it much. But she had trusted him with her life countless times. Perhaps she deserved to know his story. "I was a soldier," he began slowly, "on my world. We had a war, a big war, between different groups of humans. I was on a ship, a flying ship that could travel between worlds. We were attacked. The ship was damaged and we crashed. Here, other humans?" Barbissa asked. "From ship?" Estan's face darkened. "Dead, all dead. I was the only one who survived the crash. I buried them in the wreckage, or what was left of them." Barbissa processed this. "You alone?" "Long time, yes, long time. Maybe 3 years, maybe 4. I lost count. Now not alone," she said simply. Estan looked at her and felt a slight smile tug at his mouth. "No. Now not alone." She moved closer and leaned against his shoulder, a gesture of comfort and companionship. Estan let her stay there, an arm coming up to rest protectively around her shoulders. They sat like that in the firelight, a human and a Nari child, survivors both. The seasons continued their cycle. Winter came, bringing cold rains that turned the valley muddy and made hunting difficult. They survived on stored food, and the few animals foolish enough to wander into their traps, the shelter kept them dry and relatively warm, though there were nights when they huddled together by the fire, sharing body heat. Spring returned with an explosion of growth. The valley came alive with new plants, and the game animals returned in abundance. Estan and Barbissa thrived, their small settlement becoming more refined with each passing week. But peace never lasted forever. They first became aware of the new threat when their warning traps were triggered 3 days in a row, but nothing was caught. Something was testing their defenses, learning their patterns. Something intelligent. On the 4th night, Estan sat watch while Barbissa slept. He was tired, fighting the urge to close his eyes when he heard it, the softest whisper of movement in the darkness beyond the fire's light. He did not move, did not give any sign that he had heard. His hand slowly wrapped around his sword hilt. A spear flew out of the darkness, aimed at his chest. Easton moved at the last instant, rolling sideways, the spear embedded itself in the log he had been leaning against before he could fully rise. 3 more spears followed, coming from different angles. Barbissa, he shouted. Up, we are under attack. Figures emerged from the darkness, not Nari warriors. These were something else. Shorter and stockier, their skin a darker shade of blue, almost purple. They wore armor made from hardened leather and carried weapons that were more sophisticated than the Nari's crude spears. Swords with metal blades, real bows with tension strings. Mercenaries. Easton realized someone had hired professionals to hunt them. Barbissa burst from the shelter, her knife already in hand. She saw the attackers and immediately moved, not toward them but away from Easton, splitting their attention and making it harder for them to coordinate. The fight was chaotic. There were 6 attackers, and they were trained fighters. Easton engaged 2 of them, his sword ringing against theirs. Metal on metal, a sound he had not heard since coming to this world. These were not primitive weapons, these were real blades, forged and tempered. Barbissa led 2 others on a chase through the valley, using her small size and intimate knowledge of the terrain. She led them into the thorny bushes, then doubled back while they struggled through the undergrowth. When one emerged bleeding and furious, she was waiting on a low branch. She dropped onto his back, her knife finding the vulnerable spot at the base of his skull. Easton fought with the desperation of someone who knew he was outmatched. His opponents were skilled, their footwork precise, their strikes economical. He took a cut across his ribs, felt the hot flow of blood, but he did not fall back. He pressed forward, aggressive, using his greater height and reach to keep them from coordinating. He killed one with a thrust through the throat, the blade punching through flesh and spine. The body fell, and Easton immediately shifted to face the other, not giving him time to process the death of his companion. Barbissa reappeared, having dealt with one of her pursuers. The other had apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor, and had retreated into the darkness. 3 attackers remained, but the Mercenaries were professionals. They recognized when a contract had gone bad. Without a word, they disengaged, melting back into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. Pursuing them into the darkness would be suicide, and Easton was smart enough to recognize that. He stood in the firelight, breathing hard, blood dripping from his ribs. Barbassa moved to his side, her knife still out, scanning the darkness for any sign of another attack. "We cannot stay here," Easton said, pressing a hand to his wounded ribs. "They know where we are. They will come back with more." Barbassa nodded, already moving to gather their essential supplies. They had built this place, made it home. But survival meant being willing to abandon anything. Within an hour they were gone, moving through the darkness with only what they could carry. Behind them, their small valley settlement stood empty, the fire burning down to embers. It had been their home for months, but now it was just another place they had survived in and left behind. They traveled through the night, putting distance between themselves and the compromised camp. By dawn, they were deep in unfamiliar territory, following a rocky riverbed that would hide their tracks. Easton's ribs burned with every breath. The cut was not deep, but it was long, running from his sternum around to his side. He would need to clean it and bandage it properly, but that would have to wait until they found a safe place to stop. As the sun rose, painting the alien landscape in shades of violet and orange, they saw something in the distant structures. Actual buildings made of stone, not crude huts or temporary camps. Settlement, possibly even a town. "Do we risk it?" Barbassa asked. Easton looked at the distant structures, then at his blood-soaked shirt. They needed supplies, real medical care, information about who was hunting them, and why. "We risk it," he decided, but carefully. They approached the settlement slowly, cautiously. It was larger than Easton had first thought, a genuine town with perhaps 300 inhabitants. The buildings were made from cut stone, fitted together with surprising skill. This was not a primitive tribal village. This was civilization, or at least this world's version of it. The inhabitants were Nari, but different from the tribal warriors they had encountered before. These wore woven clothing rather than hides and skins. They carried tools rather than weapons, farmers, artisans, traders. Easton and Barbassa drew stares as they walked down the main street. A human was rare enough, but a human and a Nari child traveling together was unprecedented. People whispered, pointed, but no one moved to stop them. They found what looked like a trading post, a large building with various goods displayed in the front. An old Nari sat behind a counter, his skin faded with age, his eyes clouded but still sharp with intelligence. "We need supplies," Easton said in his broken Nari. "Have metal, have furs. Trade." The old trader looked them over slowly. His eyes lingered on Easton's blood-soaked shirt, on Barbassa's defensive stance, on the weapons they both carried with the ease of those who knew how to use them. "The legend come to life," the old trader said in surprisingly clear speech. "The sky demon and his stone child. You are far from your hunting grounds." "Someone hunting us," Easton replied, abandoning pretense. "Mercenaries. Professional fighters, you know why." The trader was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. Then he sighed. There is a bounty. The tribal council of the southern clans wants you dead. They say you killed a chief that you bring bad luck and disruption. The bounty is high enough to attract serious hunters. Easton cursed. He had hoped that killing one chief would end it, that the tribes would leave them alone. Instead, it had marked them as a problem that needed to be eliminated. How high? He asked. The trader named a sum that made Easton wince. It was enough to make a Nari wealthy for life. Every mercenary and hunter in the region would be looking for them. We need to leave the area, Easton said. Need supplies for long travel, what you need for trade. They spent the next hour negotiating. Easton traded away some of their furs and a few of the metal items he had salvaged from the crash site. In return, they got food supplies that would last for weeks, a new waterskin, a whetstone, and some bandages and medicinal herbs. The trader also provided information. North of here, he said, was a region called the Broken Peaks. It was harsh territory, difficult to traverse, and most Nari avoided it. If they could make it there, they might be able to lose their pursuers. They left the town before noon, not wanting to linger. As they walked away, Easton saw faces watching them from windows and doorway. Some showed fear, others curiosity, a few showed calculation. The bounty was known, and there was always someone willing to try their luck. We must move fast, Easton told Barbassa. The town will talk. Every hunter within a week's travel will know we were here. She nodded grimly. They had known it would be this way, that the price of their survival would be eternal vigilance, but knowledge was different from acceptance, and Easton could see the weariness in her young face. They traveled hard for the next 3 days, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Easton's wound was healing, but slowly. He had cleaned and bandaged it, but the constant movement was not helping. Still, infection had not set in, which was the important thing. On the third evening, they reached the foothills of the Broken Peaks. The name was apt. The mountains ahead were a chaotic jumble of shattered stone, as if some ancient cataclysm had broken the earth and left it lying in pieces. There were no clear paths, no easy routes. It would be slow, difficult, dangerous traveling. It would also be almost impossible for a large group to follow them. We go up, Easton said, pointing to the peaks, disappear into the stone. They began their ascent the next morning. The going was even harder than Easton had anticipated. The rock was loose and unstable, prone to giving way without warning. Several times they had to backtrack when their chosen route ended in an impassable cliff or a crevasse too wide to jump. But they pressed on, climbing higher. Behind them, the lowlands spread out in a patchwork of forest and grassland. It was beautiful in an alien way, this world that had become their home, despite trying to kill them at every turn. On the 5th day in the peaks, they found a cave. It was not large, but it was deep enough to provide shelter and had a narrow entrance that could be easily defended. More importantly, it had a hidden exit. At the back, a crack in the rock that led to another section of the mountain. If they were trapped, they had an escape route. Here, Easton said, we rest here. Heal, wait for the hunters to give up or lose our trail. They made camp in the cave, building a small fire near the entrance where the smoke would disperse. For the first time in weeks, Asden allowed himself to properly relax. They had shelter, they had supplies, and they were in a position that was nearly impossible to assault. Barbissa sat across the fire from him, her small face illuminated by the flickering light. She looked older now, Asden realized. The months of hard travel and constant danger had burned away the last of her childhood softness. She was still young, but she moved and spoke with a maturity beyond her years. "You regret," she asked suddenly, "saving me, bringing this trouble?" Asden looked at her for a long moment. Did he regret it? Life would certainly be simpler if he was still alone. He could disappear into the wilderness, become a ghost that no one could find. But he would also be alone again, carrying all his burdens by himself, with no one to watch his back and no one to care if he lived or died. "No," he said finally, "no regret, tribe of two, remember, we chose this." She smiled and some of the tension left her shoulders. "Good. I know regret too. Even with running, even with fighting, better than pit, better than tribe that throws away." They fell silent, listening to the wind howl outside the cave. The broken peaks were living up to their name, presenting them with challenge after challenge. But they had survived this long, they would survive this too. Days turned into weeks in the cave. Asden's wound healed completely, leaving another scar to add to his collection. They hunted the small animals that made their homes among the rocks and gathered water from snowmelt that trickled down the mountain face, and they trained in the relative safety of their hideout. Asden pushed Barbissa harder than ever before. He taught her grappling techniques, how to break holds and escape from larger opponents. He showed her how to use an enemy's weight and momentum against them. Barbissa absorbed it all, her body growing stronger and more capable. Her defensive armor, that strain ability that had saved both their lives, had manifested several more times during training accidents. Asden had tested its limits carefully. It seemed to trigger based on the perception of lethal danger, not just any impact. A punch that would bruise did not trigger it, but a strike that would break bone or pierce organs did. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Asden made a decision. "Tomorrow we leave the peaks," he said. "Head west. There are lands there I have heard about but never seen, far from the tribal territories. Maybe we find place where bounty not reach." Barbissa nodded. She was ready. The cave had been a good refuge, but it was not a life. They needed to keep moving, keep searching for a place where they could exist without constantly looking over their shoulders. The next morning they packed their gear and began the descent from the broken peaks. It was as treacherous as the climb up had been, perhaps more so, as the downward journey put different stresses on their legs and backs. They were halfway down, negotiating a particularly difficult section of loose scree, when Barbissa suddenly stopped. "Smoke," she said, pointing toward the lowlands. "There." Asden looked where she indicated and felt his heart sink. Multiple columns of smoke rose from the forest below in a pattern that looked deliberate, signal fires. "They are coordinating," he said grimly. "Whoever is hunting us, they have resources, organization." They continued down faster, knowing that every moment they stayed in the peaks was a moment their pursuers had to set up an ambush at the bottom. Speed was now more important than caution. They reached the tree line as the sun was setting. The forest here was different from the jungles they had left. Behind weeks ago, older, darker, with trees so massive that 3 men could not link hands. Around their trunks, the canopy blocked out most of the sky, creating a twilight world even in the middle of the day. They moved through this ancient forest for 2 days, always heading west. Signal fires had stopped, which either meant the hunters had lost their trail or had already positioned themselves and were waiting. On the 3rd day, they found out which. They were crossing a clearing when arrows began to rain down from the trees, not wild shots but precise, coordinated volleys. Someone had been tracking them, had predicted their route, and had set up an ambush with professional precision. "Run!" Asden shouted, and they sprinted for the far side of the clearing. An arrow grazed Barbissa's arm, drawing a line of blue-green blood. Another passed so close to Asden's head he felt the wind of its passage. They reached the tree line and dove into cover. Behind them, figures dropped from the trees, at least a dozen, all armed and armored. These were not tribal warriors. These were mercenaries, the kind of skilled fighters that the bounty money would attract. Asden and Barbissa ran, using every trick they knew to lose their pursuers. They crossed streams to break their scent trail, climbed trees, and jumped to other branches to confuse the tracks. Backtracked and circled, but the hunters were persistent and skilled. They stayed on the trail, relentless. The chase went on for hours. Asden's lungs burned, his legs ached. Barbissa was flagging too, her smaller size giving her speed but less endurance. They could not keep this pace up much longer. They burst into another clearing and found themselves facing a cliff. It was not a sheer drop but a steep slope covered in loose rock and sparse vegetation. Behind them they could hear their pursuers crashing through the underbrush. Down the slope, Asden decided, slide and control it better than capture. They went over the edge, half sliding, half falling down the rocky face. Asden kept Barbissa close, using his body to shield her from the worst impacts. They hit the bottom hard, tumbling into a heap. Above them, the mercenaries appeared at the edge, but they did not follow down the slope. Instead, they spread out along the top, moving to positions where they would be waiting no matter which direction Asden and Barbissa fled. Asden looked around frantically. They were in a narrow canyon with steep walls. One end led deeper into the canyon system, potentially a trap. The other end led back toward the mercenaries. Then he noticed something. At the base of the cliff, partially hidden by fallen rocks, was a dark opening, a cave or maybe a tunnel. It was their only option. "There," he said, pointing quickly. They scrambled toward the opening. It was barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, which meant it would be hell to defend, but also difficult to assault. Asden pushed Barbissa through first, then followed, having to turn sideways to fit his shoulders through the gap. Behind them they heard shouting. The mercenaries had seen them enter and were descending the slope, abandoning caution for speed. Inside, the passage was dark and narrow. Asden could barely see, the only light coming from the entrance behind them. He could hear water dripping somewhere ahead, and the air smelled of stone and cold. "Keep moving," he urged Barbissa. "Find where this goes." They stumbled forward in the darkness, hands outstretched, feeling their way along the rough stone walls. Behind them, the dim light from the entrance was blocked as the first mercenary squeezed through. The passage began to descend, the floor becoming slippery with moisture. Asden's foot slipped and he barely caught himself. They were moving blind now, with armed enemies behind them and unknown dangers ahead. Then the passage opened up. Asden could sense it more than see it. The change in acoustics, the way their movements no longer echoed so closely. They had entered a larger chamber. "Stop," Asden whispered to Barbissa. "Feel for the walls, find if there are other passages." They moved carefully in the darkness, hands on stone. Asden found 2 other openings, both leading away from the chamber. He chose the one that seemed to angle upward, hoping it might lead back to the surface rather than deeper underground. Behind them, light flickered. The mercenaries had brought torches. Asden could see shadows dancing on the passage walls as they approached. He and Barbissa moved into the new passage, feeling their way along. And GT snorts. And GT. This tunnel was different, worked stone rather than natural rock. Someone or something had carved this long ago. They moved as quickly as they dared. Behind them, the torchlight grew brighter. The mercenaries were catching up, their light allowing them to move faster than their prey in the darkness. The passage turned, then turned again. Asden lost track of direction. They could be heading back toward the surface, or deeper into the earth. There was no way to know. Then ahead he saw a light. Not torchlight, but natural illumination. The passage was leading back to the surface. Relief flooded through him. They emerged, blinking into daylight in a small gorge. The opening they had come through was in the base of a cliff face, barely visible among the rocks. Asden immediately began looking for a way to block it, to buy them time. There, a large boulder balanced precariously on the slope above the opening. With effort, he might be able to tip it. "Help me," he said to Barbissa. Together they pushed against the boulder, straining with all their strength. It did not want to move, held in place by centuries of settling. From the tunnel they heard voices. Mercenaries were close. Asden and Barbissa threw their full weight against the boulder. Something gave. The stone shifted, then began to roll. It picked up speed as it tumbled down the slope, directly toward the tunnel entrance. The crash as it sealed the opening was tremendous. Dust and rock fragments exploded outward. When the dust cleared, the tunnel was blocked by several tons of rock. It would not stop the mercenaries permanently. They could dig through or find another way around, but it would slow them down, give Astan and Barbissa a chance to get away. They did not waste time congratulating themselves. They ran from the gorge, heading in a direction Astan hoped was still generally west. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs were rubber, until the sun began to set and they could run no more. Only then did they stop, collapsing against a fallen log, gulping air. Cannot keep running forever. Barbissa gasped between breaths. They always catch up. Astan knew she was right. The bounty was too high. The mercenaries too persistent. Running would only delay the inevitable. "Then we change the game," Astan said, slowly, an idea forming. "Instead of running from hunters, we become hunters. We find whoever posted bounty, remove Zors." It was a dangerous plan, possibly suicidal, but Barbissa's eyes lit up at the suggestion. She was tired of being prey, tired of running. The idea of striking back, of taking the fight to there, appealed to her warrior instincts. How we find, she asked, the traitor in the town, Aston said, he knows about. Bounty, he might know who posted it. We go back, ask nicely or not nicely if needed. It took them 4 days to work their way back to the town they had visited weeks earlier. They approached carefully, watching for any signs of ambush or increased security. But the town seemed normal, going about its daily business. They waited until nightfall, then slipped over the town's low wall. The trading post was easy to find, one of the largest buildings with goods still displayed in the windows. The door was locked, but locks on this world were primitive. Aston had it open in seconds using a piece of bent metal. They slipped inside, silent as ghosts. The old trader was asleep in a back room. He woke to find Aston's knife at his throat and Barbassa blocking the only exit. Remember us? Aston asked quietly. Trader's eyes went wide with recognition and fear. He nodded slowly, very aware of the sharp metal pressing against his skin. Good. Need information. Who posted the bounty? Who wants us dead? The trader hesitated. Aston pressed the knife a little harder, not enough to break skin, but enough to make his seriousness clear. The Southern Tribal Council, trader said quickly, led by chief named Corbin. They meet at Gathering Stone, 3 days south from here. They the ones who pool resources for bounty. Why they care so much? Aston asked. We just want to survive. You killed chiefs. You proved Nari can be beaten. That dangerous for tribal leaders. They want you gone before you inspire others to challenge their power. Aston processed this. It was not personal vendetta, it was politics. They had become symbols of defiance, and symbols were dangerous to those in power. This Corbin, Aston said. Tell me about him. The trader talked, providing details about the chief who had orchestrated the hunt for them. Corbin was young for a tribal leader. Ambitious and ruthless, he had united several tribes under his banner through a combination of charisma and brutal suppression of dissent. He wanted to expand his influence, and eliminating the demon and his stone child would enhance his reputation. When Aston was satisfied he had all the useful information, he pulled the knife away from the trader's throat. You tell no one we were here, he said, or we come back. The trader nodded frantically, and Aston and Barbassa slipped back out into the night. 3 days later they lay on a hillside, overlooking the Gathering Stone. It was an ancient formation, a circle of standing stones in a clearing. Below, the Southern Tribal Council was meeting. 7 chiefs from different tribes, each with their personal guards, discussing matters of mutual interest. Aston studied them through a crude spyglass he had made from salvaged lens pieces. He counted approximately 30 warriors, all well armed. A direct assault would be suicide, but he had not survived this long by fighting fair. We do not attack, he told Barbassa. We divide, make them fight each other. Over the next hours, Aston explained his plan. It was risky, relying on time and the tribal chiefs' mutual distrust, but it had a chance of working. That night, while the council slept in their tents, Barbassa crept into the camp. She moved like a shadow, unseen and unheard. She found the tent of Chief Corbin and left something inside. A bloody knife and a piece of cloth, marked with the symbol of another tribe's chief. Then she moved to another tent and planted evidence suggesting that chief had been plotting with Corbin against The others, by dawn, suspicion and paranoia had taken root. Chiefs accused each other. Warriors drew weapons. What should have been a united council dissolved into chaos. In the confusion, Astan struck. He fired an arrow, not at any chief but at a tent, setting it ablaze. More fires followed. The camp descended into complete panic. Corbin, recognizing that his council had been destroyed, ordered his guards to retreat, but as they fled, Astan was waiting, not with sword drawn, but with a rock slide he had carefully prepared on the hillside above their escape route. The boulders came tumbling down, cutting off the path and scattering the warriors. In the chaos, Astan dropped from a tree onto Corbin himself. The chief was strong and a skilled fighter, but he was surprised and off balance. The fight was brief and brutal. Astan had no interest in honor or fairness. He drove his knee into Corbin's gut, slammed his head against the tree, and put his knife against the chief's throat. Call off the bounty, Astan said. Now, Corbin, bleeding and beaten, glared at him with hatred but also respect. He had been outmaneuvered by a superior tactician. Call it off and you live, Astan pressed. Keep it active and you die. Here, your choice. Corbin made his choice. He shouted orders to his scattered warriors, calling them to witness. He declared the bounty lifted, the hunt ended. The demon and stone child were to be left alone, granted safe passage through all tribal lands. Astan released him, knowing that without witnesses the chief could easily recant, but with his own warriors hearing the declaration, Corbin's honor was bound to his word. Astan and Barbassa disappeared into the forest before the chaos fully settled. Behind them, the Southern Tribal Council was in ruins, its unity shattered. The bounty was officially lifted. They traveled for 2 more days before stopping to rest, wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the council. Only when Astan was satisfied they were truly safe did he allow himself to believe it was over. We did it, Barbassa said, her voice full of wonder. We survived. Astan smiled, a rare, genuine expression. Yes, we survived. They made camp that night by a quiet stream in a grove of trees with soft grass. For the first time in months, they did not post a watch. They let themselves simply rest, truly rest, without the constant vigilance of hunted prey. As the fire burned down to embers, Barbassa spoke. What now? Where we go? Astan looked at the alien stars above them. West. Keep going west. Find a place where we can build something permanent, not hiding but living. Home, Barbassa said softly. Yes, Astan agreed. Home. They fell asleep under those strange stars, a human and a Nari child. Warriors and survivors, bound together by shared trials and mutual choice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every tomorrow did on this brutal and beautiful world, but tonight they had peace. The legend would grow. Stories of the sky demon and his stone shield child would spread across the tribal lands, changing with each telling. Some would say they had ascended to become gods. Others would claim they were spirits of vengeance. A few would remember the truth. They were survivors, nothing more and nothing less. But for Astan and Barbassa, legends did not matter. What mattered was that they had found each other in the pit, in the wilderness, had forged a bond stronger than blood, and had carved out a place for themselves in a world that had wanted them dead. They were a tribe of two, and on this harsh, unforgiving world, that was everything. But the world had other ideas about their peace. 2 weeks into their westward journey, they encountered something neither had seen before. The forest opened onto a vast grassland, and in the distance they could see structures, not tribal villages or crude settlements, but genuine buildings made of shaped stone and wood, arranged in organized rows. Town, Barbassa said, pointing. Big town. It was larger than anything Astan had seen since arriving on this planet. As they drew closer, staying to the tree line for cover, he estimated at least 1,000 inhabitants. The walls were thick and well maintained, with guards posted at regular intervals. This was a civilization, not just a collection of survivors. They watched from hiding as Nari came and went through the main gate. These people looked different from the tribal warriors, cleaner, better fed, wearing clothes that showed actual craftsmanship. Some pulled carts loaded with goods. Others carried tools for trade or farming. "We go in?" Barbassa asked. Astan studied the gate guards. They looked alert but not particularly aggressive. This was a trading town, accustomed to strangers. Still, walking in as a human might attract unwanted attention. "We observe first," he decided. Learn. They spent 3 days watching the town's rhythms. The gates opened at dawn and closed at dusk. Merchants came and went. There seemed to be some sort of market day every third day, when the traffic increased dramatically. More importantly, Astan noticed that the guards did not stop or question everyone, only those who looked suspicious or heavily armed. "We go in on market day," Astan told Barbassa. "Blend with crowd, hide weapons under cloaks, act like traders." They prepared carefully. Astan wrapped his sword in cloth and slung it across his back under a ragged cloak he had fashioned from hides. His knife went into his boot. Barbassa did the same with her smaller weapons. They gathered some furs and a few interesting stones to carry, making themselves look like small-time traders. Market day came. The roads leading to the town were crowded with Nari from surrounding settlements, all heading to trade. Astan and Barbassa joined the flow, keeping their heads down, moving with the crowd. The guards at the gate barely glanced at them. They were too busy managing the flow of people and collecting some sort of entry tax from the larger merchants. Astan and Barbassa slipped through without incident. Inside, the town was overwhelming after months in the wilderness. The noise of hundreds of voices, the smells of cooking food and unwashed bodies, the press of the crowd. It was almost too much, but there was also something else: opportunity. They moved through the market, observing. Vendors sold everything from food to tools to weapons. There was a section for livestock, another for cloth and clothing, a third for exotic goods brought from distant lands, and everywhere there was metal. Real forged metal, not just salvaged scraps. Astan felt a hunger looking at those metal tools and weapons. With proper equipment, their survival would become so much easier, but they had little to trade, and drawing attention by trying to bargain for weapons would defeat the purpose of staying inconspicuous. They were passing a food stall when Barbassa suddenly grabbed Astan's arm, pulling him into an alley between two buildings. Her eyes were wide with alarm. Mercenary, she whispered from the ones who chased us. Aston carefully peered around the corner there, browsing at a weapon. Stahl was indeed one of the mercenaries who had ambushed them weeks ago. The Nari's face was unmistakable, scarred and cruel, with a missing ear from some past battle. The bounty was officially lifted. But would this mercenary know that? And even if he did, he might decide to try his luck anyway, hoping the legend of the Sky Demon and his shield were exaggerated. We leave, Aston said. Quietly, slowly, no running. They turned to exit the alley the other direction. And GT clear his throat. And GT, but found their path blocked. 3 young Nari males, street toughs by the look of them, had noticed the strangers and seen an opportunity. Nice cloaks, one of them said, grinning to show filed teeth. We take, you leave, no trouble. Aston's hand drifted toward his concealed knife, but Barbassa caught his eye and shook her head slightly. She stepped forward, making herself look even smaller and more vulnerable than she was. Please, she said in Nari, her voice trembling, we have nothing, just poor traitors. The lead tough laughed and reached for her. Then we take little Nari girl, so you make coin that way. His hand closed on her arm, and in that instant Barbassa moved. Her training with Aston had made her fast and precise. She drove her thumb into the pressure point on the inside of his wrist while simultaneously stomping on his foot. His grip loosened in pain and surprise, and she slipped free, already moving behind him. Before the other two could react, she had her small knife at their leader's throat. We leave now, she said, her voice no longer trembling. You let us. The toughs backed away, hands raised. They had not expected prey that bit back. Barbassa released their leader with a shove, and she and Aston walked quickly toward the alley's exit. They had almost made it when a voice called out behind them, "Stop them, that is the Stone Child." The mercenary had spotted them. His shout drew attention from the crowd. Heads turned. Aston saw recognition dawning on several faces. The legend had spread far. Run, Aston said, and they bolted. The market erupted into chaos as they sprinted through it, knocking over stalls and scattering goods. Behind them, the mercenary was shouting, rallying others to the chase. Some joined out of greed, hoping to claim the bounty they had not heard was lifted. Others joined from simple mob mentality. Aston and Barbassa ran through the twisting streets of the town. Their knowledge of the layout limited. They turned corners blindly, hoping to lose pursuers, but the shouts behind them never seemed to fade. They burst into a square and found themselves facing the town's central well. There was no obvious exit except back the way they came, where their pursuers were emerging. They were trapped. Aston drew his sword from under his cloak, abandoning any pretense. Barbassa pulled her knife. They stood back to back, ready to fight. Then a door opened in the building beside them. An old Nari female, her skin faded almost to white with age, gestured urgently. Inside, quickly. They had no better option. Aston and Barbassa darted through the door. The old female slammed it shut behind them and threw a heavy bar across it. Outside, they could hear the mob arriving in the square, confused at their quarry's disappearance. Upstairs, the old female said, to the roof. You can jump to next building. Then next, work your way to wall. Why help us? Aston asked, suspicious. The old female smiled, showing gaps where teeth had once been. And GT, clears throat. And GT, because I was once young and hunted. 2, because legends should not die in Market Square. Now go. They will search houses soon. They climbed the narrow stairs to the roof. As promised, the buildings were close enough to jump between. Aston went first, landing heavily on the next roof, then caught Barbassa as she jumped after him. They made their way across the rooftops, moving away from the square. Below they could hear the mob spreading out searching. When they reached the wall, Aston saw their path, a drainage channel that ran under it, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. It was disgusting, filled with filth and waste, but it was also unguarded. They slid into the channel and crawled through the muck, emerging outside the wall stinking but free. They did not stop running until they were deep in the forest, miles from the town. Only then did they collapse, gasping for breath, checking themselves for injuries. No more towns, Barbassa said firmly. Agreed, Aston replied. We find empty place, build our own. They traveled for another week, finally finding what they sought, a hidden valley, lush and green, with a waterfall and a cave for shelter. There were no signs of Nari presence, no trails or settlements nearby. It was isolated, defensible, and perfect. Here, Aston said. This is home. They began building, not a temporary camp, but a real home, a solid structure, using logs and stone, a garden for growing food, traps and defenses around the perimeter. It would take time, but they had time. Now the running was over. As they worked building their sanctuary, Aston realized something. He had stopped counting the days since the crash. Somewhere in the journey with Barbassa, survival had stopped being about eventually escaping this world and had become about living in it. This was his home now, she was his family, and that was enough.